Welcome to Chapter 1, Classical Criticism. In this section, we step into the foundations of Western literary thought with four towering names: Plato, Aristotle, Horace, and Longinus. Their ideas on mimesis, catharsis, poetic rules, and the sublime shape centuries of criticism and still echo in your UGC English exam today. Inside the app, you'll find everything you need: lesson plan, videos, detailed PDF notes, PYQs, last-minute revision notes, classroom handouts, and even the diary notes hub for quick recall. So, download the app now and begin your journey with the masters who first defined what literature means, how it should be judged, and why it matters. Let's step back into the ancient world, where Western philosophy truly begins with Plato. Born around 427 BC, he was a close companion of Socrates and later became the teacher of Aristotle, forming a golden chain of philosophy. Around 387 BC, he founded the academy near Athens, the first great institution of higher learning in the Western world, asked an exam. Plato's works survive mostly as dialogues, blending philosophy with drama. His early dialogues, Apology, Meno, Crito, and Gorgias, record the voice of Socrates as he wrestles with questions of virtue and happiness. His great masterpieces, Republic, Phaedo, Symposium, and Timaeus, are essential to the canon asked in exam. Here, he explored immortality of the soul, the ideal state, the ordering of the cosmos, and the very foundations of truth. Later works like Laws and Parmenides turn to legislation and metaphysics, pushing dialectic to its limits. Pause here and note this: Plato introduced key metaphysical ideas. He proposed the immortality of the rational soul, the demiurge or divine craftsman who orders the cosmos, and the world soul that animates all creation. Above all, his theory of forms or ideas, timeless, perfect realities, remains one of the most influential contributions in philosophy. But Plato also gave us a systematic critique of art. In texts like the Republic and Ion, he argued that art is mimesis, mere imitation of reality asked in exam. For him, art appeals to emotion rather than reason, and if left unchecked, it risks corrupting individuals and society. Yet he admitted that, properly guided, art could shape moral attitudes and orient the soul toward truth. His legacy carried forward through Neoplatonism, founded by Plotinus and Porphyry, asked in exam. These thinkers reinterpreted Plato with a mystical lens, blending his ideas with Aristotle's. Yes, the Neoplatonists actively reconciled Plato and Aristotle asked in exam. They drew on dialogues like Phaedrus, Ion, and Republic to argue that art, far from corrupting, could guide the soul toward ultimate reality. And here's a fascinating detail often discussed in modern theory. In Timaeus, Plato introduced the concept of chora, a creative receptacle or matrix where things come into being in response to the good asked in exam. Later thinkers picked this up. Jacques Derrida even wrote a short text titled Hora asked in exam. And Julia Kristeva used the idea to distinguish between the semiotic, the pre-symbolic drives and rhythms, and the symbolic, structured language and law asked in exam. Plato's Republic is one of the greatest philosophical dialogues of all time, framed as a conversation mainly between Socrates, Glaucon, and Adeimantus. Yes, the 36th dialogue featuring Glaucon and Adeimantus has been asked in exam. At its heart is a powerful question posed by Glaucon: why should I be just? From there, Socrates leads his companions through a grand exploration of politics, education, art, and metaphysics. The Republic lays out Plato's vision of the ideal state, a society built on the pursuit of the good, where harmony in the soul mirrors harmony in the state. One of its central myths is the allegory of the cave, a parable about the effect of education on our nature. Asked in exam. Prisoners see only shadows on the wall, mistaking appearances for reality, until one turns around, ascends out of the cave, and finally sees the sun itself. For Plato, this journey represents the soul's ascent from ignorance to truth. Now pause here and note this. Plato's theory of forms is central. He divided reality into the visible and the intelligible realms. Asked in exam. The visible realm is always changing, full of imperfection. The intelligible realm, however, is eternal, unified, and changeless. Objects in our world say, a beautiful flower or a drawn triangle are beautiful or triangular only because they participate in the ideal forms of beauty or geometry. True knowledge comes not from appearances but from these eternal forms, which provide the foundation for both science and morality. In the Republic, poetry is banished from the ideal state asked in exam. Why? Because art is imitation. If physical things are already imperfect copies of forms, then art is a copy of a copy, twice removed from truth. Literature, painting, or sculpture, instead of leading the soul upward, drag it downward by appealing to emotions rather than reason. Worse, poetry often glorifies immorality as seen, Plato thought, in Homer's Iliad. This judgment makes art dangerous, even corrupting, and so Plato insisted it must be strictly regulated. Yet, at the same time, he admitted its power. Art imitates, persuades, and moves people, which is precisely why it cannot be left unchecked. By subordinating art to philosophy, Plato aimed to guide culture toward truth instead of illusion. So, the Republic gives us three enduring debates. What is justice? What is reality? The world of forms or appearances? And what is the place of art teacher of truth or deceiver of the soul? These questions, asked more than 2000 years ago, still shape political philosophy and aesthetics today. And his view of poetry is both radical and deeply suspicious. For Plato, poetry is twice removed from truth and reality, asked in exam. Why? Because it imitates physical objects, which themselves are already imperfect shadows of the eternal forms. That means poetry imitates an imitation. Instead of giving us truth, it only gives us illusion. Pause here. Plato described poetry as an imitation of reality and distant from reality, asked in exam. He saw the poet not as a knower but as an imitator, someone who writes not through rational thought but through sudden inspiration. And inspiration for Plato was unreliable, more like madness than wisdom. He believed poets stir emotions, weaken reasoning, and offer no real knowledge, asked in exam. In his eyes, poetry could even become dangerous, the mother of lies, capable of corrupting citizens by exciting passions instead of disciplining thought. Plato's objections rested on three big points. First, poetry appeals to emotion rather than reason. Second, it treats virtue and vice alike, offering no moral guidance. And third, it fails to cultivate intellect the way philosophy does. For him, poetry was only valuable if it served truth and moral education. Otherwise, it risked leading people astray. But Plato's attack didn't go unanswered. Philip Sidney, in the Apology for Poetry asked in exam, directly refuted the idea that poets are liars, claiming instead that the poet nothing affirms and therefore never lieth. Centuries later, P.B. Shelley, in A Defense of Poetry, insisted that poetry contributes to moral and social progress. For both Sidney and Shelley, poetry was not corrupting, it was uplifting, a force that teaches, delights, and refines the soul. Plato set the stage for the battle between poetry and philosophy. On one side, art as imitation and emotional appeal. On the other, philosophy as reason and truth. This tension has shaped centuries of debate on the value, function, and moral responsibility of literature. Let's begin with Plato's highest principle, the idea of the good. For him, the good was the ultimate source of truth, justice, and harmony. He compared it to the sun. Just as the sun makes sight and growth possible, the good makes knowledge and existence intelligible. Only the philosopher who grasps the good can perceive the true order of the cosmos. And this is why, in Plato's vision, philosophers alone are qualified to rule a just state because their leadership would align with universal harmony. But Plato's philosophy also carried a sharp critique of art, poetry, and drama. He He saw drama as particularly dangerous because of its public nature. Unlike poetry read privately, drama on stage relied on collective emotional reaction. To win applause, dramatists often used quarrels, lamentations, and exaggerated gestures, things that, in Plato's view, degraded audiences rather than elevating them. Pause here and note this. Plato feared that spectators would lose their individuality in the crowd, swept away by emotion. Instead of strengthening rational control, theatre dissolved it. This is why he demanded that plays should present noble characters, since audiences often model themselves on what they see. He objected strongly to both tragedy and comedy. Tragedy, he argued, indulges excessive grief and pity, while comedy provokes ridicule of flawed characters. Both, in his judgment, distorted moral sensibility. For Plato, cowardice and crime should be corrected with compassion, not laughed at or indulged. Comic characters should be lovable, not laughable. This critique linked to his wider suspicion of rhetoric and language. Living in an age dominated by oratory, Plato insisted that speech and writing must serve truth and moral formation. Eloquence without truth, he warned, is dangerous, it seduces, but it does not instruct.